Yeah, but it's up to him to mend himself, and we're giving him every opportunity.
He fucking left the band! He fucking left the band! Which part of that is... Hello? Do you know what I mean? He fucking left the band!
Hello everyone, it's your local Trash Panda Slayer here, with a heavy emphasis on the trash part of that sentence. In my previous video, I covered the load and reload era of Metallica, an era that divides fan opinion. I came into it with fresh ears and ended up finding those albums to be alright, Load in particular, and I know I'm not alone in that. I know some people who love Load and Reload and consider them to be among Metallica's best. Well, today, we are venturing into the true dark age of Metallica, one that doesn't just divide fan opinion, but is largely considered by almost every single person to be Metallica's worst album, not counting that collab with Lou Reed. That's a whole different can of worms. Released in 2003, St. Anger, despite topping charts around the world, went on to be a largely reviled album that every rock fan bought only to regret it the second they heard those godforsaken drums. Most universally reviled and critically panned albums flopped and barely anyone bought them, but this is a platinum-selling album that barely anyone likes. I did say barely, there are some fans, I'll get into that later, but 90% of people will say that this album is a grating and repetitive monster of an album, some kind of monster even. Now, I didn't experience this album during release, I was watching Teletubbies and Blue's Clues back then, but I did get to hear a few songs off of it later in the 2000s and early 2010s on my iPod Shuffle that I got for Christmas in 2008. Alongside a Nintendo DS with 2 Guitar Hero games. Man, 2008 to 2012 was just such a great time, I wish I could go back. Anywho, the 2 St. Anger tracks on this dinky little iPod with no effing screen was the title track and Some Kind of Monster. Now that first track I remember liking the first minute or two of until it kept going into the softer post-grunge inspired parts, and I actually remember loving Some Kind of Monster, although even then the snare drum stuck out like a sore thumb. And I had other problems, like how it takes 2 whole minutes for Some Kind of Monster for the vocals to kick in. But that was all I heard of the album. I wouldn't get a computer of my own and constant internet access until 2011, so sometime during the 2010s, I heard the whole album. I think it was from Rocked Review's Regretting the Past episode on St. Anger. I loved that series back in 2016. And yeah, I totally see why this is such a controversial album. This album alone must have increased sales of Tylenol by at least 10 times back in 2003. Anyways, the album starts off with Frantic, and wow, those drums and crappy sounding guitars just hit you like a brick to the naughty bits. Many people were confused by this decision to have the snare drum's snares be disconnected, creating that clangy trash can sound, especially since it plasters the entire album. To add to that, there's nu metal influences, James Hetfield's vocals occasionally go out of tune, and some of the lyrics are just ridiculous. My lifestyle determines my death style? That's kinda laughable, and we cannot forget that Fran tick 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 tock. Saint Anger is kind of a mess of a song. It can't decide whether it's thrash metal, post-grunge, nu metal, or garage rock. You have these parts with fast-paced drums and heavy guitars that transition immediately into sad-sounding post-grunge styled stuff. And also, it's just super repetitive for a song that lasts 7 minutes, with no solos or interesting passages to fill things out. This is seen as the highlight of the album, and quite frankly, I don't like it. It's just such a chore to listen to, and it drags on for way longer than it actually needs to. Some Kind of Monster is an apt title for a song that's 8.5 minutes long. Jesus Christ, this isn't 70s prog rock, folks. It's 4 middle-aged dudes banging it out like they're 12-year-olds who just picked up instruments. Some of the riffs are cool, and even some of the lyrics I do kinda like, but yeah, it's also kind of a slog, and that snare is starting to give me a headache. Track number 4 isn't a ballad for once. Metallica loved doing that, along with having the title track be number 2, this album included. Yeah, Well, this album is number 2. I gotta say, this is probably the best song on the album so far, with some cool riffs and a nice punk vibe. If it was a shorter 2-minute song, this could have worked. But unfortunately, it's 5.5 minutes, which is short for this album, all things considered. Invisible Kid uses drop A tuning, if I'm not mistaken, and would have sounded cool had it not been for that trash can that caveman Lars is constantly banging on. My World is where this album really started grating on me. The repetitive lyrics, snare drum, and overly long song lengths are just, ugh. Shoot Me Again is one of the silliest sounding songs on this album, with that chorus, I guess you could call it that, and again, it's just too effing long. Like, I have no shame in admitting I skipped parts of this album because all the songs would do is just repeat with no cool solos. Why would Kirk Hammett sign off on an album that doesn't utilize his talents? That's crazy. Like, imagine pitching a Metallica album with no solos back in the 80s or 90s. You'd get laughed out of the room. Sweet Amber has some decent stoner metal riffs that I think are cool, and is only 5 minutes long, short for the standards of this album. The Unnamed Feeling is one of the better songs in this album, to be honest, probably because of the slower pace. And I also like the quieter parts as well. Honestly, it's not that bad of a song. Man, Purify just sounds like almost every other song on this album. The out-of-tune vocals from Hetfield are really starting to get annoying, but thankfully it's almost over. All Within My Hands is the sad, pathetic end to this miserable album. By now, I have a headache due to the constant snare and repetitive songs. Ending the song by screaming, "Unalive," over and over again is just such a bad way to end an already terrible album. So yeah, this wasn't that fun of a listen. I didn't enjoy the majority of this album, and no joke, it really did make my head hurt. I don't even know what they were thinking with this. It just sounds like middle school kids banging it out in a garage as opposed to a group of talented metal musicians once renowned for their talent and songwriting skills. I don't know what happened other than that the band was going through a lot of problems at this point, such as rehab and the departure of bassist Jason Newsted, that probably led to them being so out of it to where they would actually record an album this bad. There's a whole documentary about this, called Some Kind of Monster. Definitely worth a watch. You get to see this band going through a full-blown midlife crisis and arguing with each other in the studio, generally having a miserable time. This album definitely is a product of a bunch of middle-aged guys on the verge of a band breakup. Somehow, some kind of way though, it only got better after this album dropped. Both their music and the relationship between the band. Sure, the album sucked and was reviewed poorly, but after all that, they managed to get things straight and got back to making alright music. I guess Saint Anger was just a necessary evil that the band had to commit for things to get better for them, and I applaud the band for improving in every way after this disaster of an album. As for the album itself, yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. It's very straining on the ears and is just a slog to sit through. Imagine an incompetent high school band making songs that drag out as long as something from a 70s prog rock album. Doesn't sound fun, huh? Well, this album unfortunately isn't. Although, there are actually people who enjoy this album, surprisingly enough, and I will respect the opinions of those who do. I think this album that's like Vegemite or pineapples on pizza, an acquired taste that some people hate, but other people actually love. And if you want to hear a version of Saint Anger that is actually halfway listenable, I'd recommend Saint Anger 2015, a fully re-recorded version made by fans. And wow, it makes a world of difference when the drums sound clear, the guitars sound good, and the songs are cut in half lengthwise. Just add some guitar solos into this, and I think this would be a decent album. Definitely give this version a listen. But as for the actual album, I wouldn't recommend it. Definitely one of the worst albums Metallica has ever made, if not the worst. Now, all things considered, as bad as this album is, I kinda hate how for a long time, people would constantly bring this album up whenever talking about Metallica, whether it be Metallica haters or Metallica fans who only listen to their 80s output. It's just one of those albums that fans refuse to forgive the band for, as if they did something morally reprehensible. Like, as bad as this album is, I don't think it should define Metallica. Nobody constantly brings up Summer in Paradise when bringing up the Beach Boys or Van Halen 3 when talking about Van Halen, but Metallica fans just obsessed over their disappointment with this album and wouldn't shut up about it for years. Fellas, ladies, others, hear me out. Bands are allowed to make bad albums, and we as human beings are allowed to make mistakes. That's what makes us humans. I've made videos that didn't go down well, you're probably familiar with that, but should my mistakes define me? No. And the same goes for anybody watching this video. Unless it's something that's genuinely horrible and morally reprehensible, mistakes should not define us. If other bands can make arguably worse albums and not have them haunt the band like a phantom, then so can Metallica. I think it's time to move on past the disappointment and forgive Metallica for their midlife crisis. Although, maybe we shouldn't forget it. Forgive your enemies, but never forget their names. Anyways, be sure to follow my Bandcamp and follow me on my socials as well. This has been your local Trash Panda Slayer, signing off.